Welcome to Beyond the Walls, a podcast for women ready to break barriers and step boldly into their purpose. I'm Kylie, your coach and guide for overcoming fear, silencing self-doubt, and building a life of courage and connection. Whether faith is your anchor or you're still trying to figure it out, this is a space for growth, authenticity, and transformation. Subscribe now and let's start building the courage to be seen, heard, and unstoppable. This is Beyond the Walls, where your purpose begins. Welcome back to the podcast. I have a fantastic guest with me today. Her name is Dr. Pam George. She is a new author that wrote an amazing book that I can't wait to read called Sparkle. It is 7 Steps to a Joy-Infused Life. And if you've been around Beyond the Walls, I'm all about figuring out how to recreate, rediscover, how do we get that joy back in our lives. And I am excited to introduce her to you today. She's going to share a little bit about her journey of how that book even came about. And I think even just sharing a lot of that camaraderie of we start off in life so excited and knowing what we're doing, and then suddenly the rough stages come, and it's so tempting to feel like we did something wrong, we made a bad decision, as if like what we're experiencing shouldn't have happened, and we failed somehow. And Pam, I know that you have such a hopeful message that is not true. And how can we find peace and comfort in those rocky stages to get us to the other side? So welcome to the podcast. Tell us your story.
Thank you, Kylie. It is so awesome to be able to come and just spend this time with you. I love even just the title of your podcast, Beyond the Walls, because we go through life and then we might hit a wall.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get stuck. And so you asked me to share my story, and I thought I will use a framework that is very popular in the Christian world. There are frameworks kind of help us make sense of things that we're going through.
Yeah.
And so this model is Hagbard and Gulich is the one who created this model. And so it just kind of goes through our journey. So as I'm sharing my journey, I thought I'll just use that model to kind of break it down. So the first step, and it's basically the stages of our faith journey. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And my faith journey began when we feel powerless, when something overwhelms us. I remember when I was, I think, 5, and my grandmother, whom I loved dearly, was hurting and she was in pain. And that was the first time I consciously remember calling out to God. Growing up in a Christian household, that was what was taught to me. And so I said, God, if you are there, heal my grandma, because I was just desperate. And so that first step is the point in our lives where we recognize that we need a power that's outside of us to be able to help us during that powerless feelings.
Yeah.
So then as an adult and growing up in Chicago, I remember just feeling very self-sufficient, kind of forgot about God. And here and there, I would pray when I felt overwhelmed, but it wasn't like a constant relationship. And going to college, someone invited me to study the Bible. And that was the first time, even though I've heard like, Jesus loves me, this I know, and he died for my sins. That was the first time I felt like she actually went through the cross and what Jesus went through. And that was the first time I'm like, somebody loves me unconditionally. And so the recognizing that God loves me, and that was I guess the wall with that stage was believing it.
Yeah.
Because I felt like I'm this puny person. He loves everybody. Does he really love me individually?
Yeah.
And so that was that was the stage where I recognized God.
Yeah.
And and I and after like encouragement, I'm like, I'm just going to believe this. I'm going to
Mm,
believe that I'm loved. I don't need to be looking for love in all the wrong places. Like
yeah.
I was looking for love and validation from my boyfriend,
Mm,
my job, my like what other people thought about me made me
yeah.
feel a lot secure. And this is like, can I trust that this God loves me and that's
Mm,
enough?
yeah.
So that's the first stage.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think there's
So
so much, I think in that, right? Like there's this childlike faith that sort of
mhm,
is, it feels personal, but we don't really need that personalness so much, right? Like when we're five, because
mhm,
hopefully most of us had loving parents, or we at least didn't feel like super alone, right? But I love that you acknowledge that later on, we really do have to somehow make our faith our own, right?
yeah.
Like, and I
Yeah.
remember wrestling through that stage in my college years too of, okay, is this, do I just believe this because this is just what I grew up with? This is all I've ever known. But then
Mhm,
even for you to personalize, because I think I had to really recognize that too for myself of, okay, there's this generic love, like God loves
mhm.
everybody, but how
Right.
personal is it, right? And so it sounds like that really was a wall for you of like, okay, this, I have to own this personally. This means
Right.
something, not just a generic, oh, kumbaya, right?
Yep, yep, exactly. And there was a scripture that kind of convicted me because it said the work of Jesus was telling the people, because when they were, I think, asking, so what's the work we have to do? And he said the
Mm,
work of God is just to believe in the one he has sent.
yeah.
And so my wall was, am I going to believe this?
Yeah.
So I kind of went the radical way because my ancestry I'm from India.
Yeah.
And around that time, I'll move into that second stage. That the second stage is the life of discipleship.
Mm,
So, where you get mentored and trained and taught, how do we live this faith? So, I made a decision. Yep, I'm going to be a disciple. I'm
yeah.
going to trust this. I'm going to believe in this. So, going to that second stage, that was a time in Chicago, they were planting churches in India.
Mm,
And I remember the minister asking me, "Hey, you're from India, right? You should think about going on this mission team to India." And I was like, "No, okay, I know that God loves me, but I don't know if I'm ready to like give up everything, my
mm,
family, my job, my career. I just graduated. Am I willing to trust and like go on this place,
yes.
this strange place, not knowing the people?" And I remember wrestling with that, and I said, "Well,
Mhm,
the work of God is this, to believe in the one He has sent.
mm,
Maybe this is a good opportunity to test whether God's real."
mm,
So I remember sitting on the plane and praying. I said, "God, if you're real, show me. You
mm,
say in the scriptures, give up everything for you. Show me if you're real." And for me, I thought, let me just do it for like 3 months because I got a 3-month visa.
okay.
A little mission trip, I'll go for 3 months. And I was dating someone at that time, and I just told him, I'm just going to go for this because I made this commitment to God, and um, I want to see if He's real.
Yeah.
So that life of discipleship is that second stage where we're looking for a community where you feel
Mhm,
loved and belonging. And I was like leaving my community to do that.
yeah.
But looking back, uh, I ended up staying there for 15 years,
Wow.
got a husband, had two of my kids there, lived in so many different countries. I was in Sri Lanka, Pakistan,
Wow.
Bangladesh, all of South Asian countries, got to plant a lot of churches. And God was real
Yeah.
because when you're in a country where you don't have the securities that
Yeah.
we have naturally here, you literally are holding God's hand through different phases and
Mm,
different cities. And especially when you have children, moving them to different cities, In Sri Lanka, we lived in the time of the Civil War.
Oh.
So there was like lockdowns. And I know there was
Mm.
one time I woke up with a woman police officer having a gun on me because she thought we were terrorists. And so going through all of those experiences
Yeah.
and looking back, I was like, hey, how come I didn't fear those things? How come
Mm.
I deeply trusted God?
Yeah.
But there was this time where the life of discipleship for me meant there were things that I held on to that got me security that God was weaning out of me. Obviously, the job,
Mm.
the financial security, and all that stuff. But one of the things was even when I got engaged to my husband, our marriage got like he kind of broke up with me,
Mm.
and the wedding was set, everything was set, and that kind of you go through this broken heart of
Yeah.
what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
And I think that leads me to the wall at that stage of discipleship is we can do all the right things
Yeah.
and we can but we really have to go back and let God build our security
Yeah.
when those uncertain times come that he is our rock.
Yeah.
And so what in the stages the walls that the researchers have found when people go through the life of discipleship
Yeah.
is they might develop this us and them mentality
Mm.
where I'm wrong. I'm doing everything right. I'm following but you're wrong. And so we have to resist that.
Yeah.
And so being in countries where people naturally are not taught Christianity, Bangladesh is maybe 99% Muslim.
Mm.
Sri Lanka was 90% Buddhist. India is over 90% Hindu. And so being with people that necessarily didn't necessarily share the beliefs that I grew up in
Yeah.
and being able to resist that I'm right, you're wrong, and let
Mm.
me be like Jesus. I'm not here to be a savior.
Yeah.
So that can be the wall of in the life of discipleship.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I appreciate you bringing that up. Okay, so as a side note, then, so we can follow along. So you went
Yes.
to India with a boyfriend. Is that the person you got engaged to and then got married
Okay,
to,
so
or who are these
yes.
guys?
Yeah. So when I became a disciple in college, um, in the church in Chicago, I was beginning to date someone
Okay.
that was in Chicago. But then when I planned to go to India, the person that I was dating was Caucasian, and India was going through some persecution at that time.
Mm.
So you had to be brown skin to
Oh
go
my.
to India
Mm.
because they were kicking out everyone
Oh
who
wow.
didn't have that. So the cost for me was to break up with that person to go. And
Mm.
for me, as you can, at that time, I wasn't wholehearted trusting. So I'm like, I'm just going to go for 3 months because I got a 3 month visa. So,
Yeah.
and so eventually I had to kind of break up with him
Mm.
because God had a different plan. So
Yes, because obviously you stayed in India. So that.
it's hard to make those decisions. And the life of discipleship is letting God unwheel parts of our hearts that we want
Yeah.
and letting God make us, it's like becoming like Jesus.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the disciple is a follower of Jesus. And how did Jesus, what did he put his trust in? And so for me, I was putting my wall before recognizing or holding on to God was relationships. I've always had
Mm.
someone that I felt kind of, completed me. When
Yeah.
God was like, "Nope, I'm the one who's going to complete
Yeah.
you." So pause.
Yeah. Well, and I love the grace. Like I think
Yes,
the older we get, the more
yeah,
hindsight we get, and we can look back and we can see how God was with
yeah,
us, like every step of the way, to
right.
even just to graciously make us
Yes.
take those baby steps of faith, right? Like
Right?
it wasn't
Exactly. Just
just
baby steps of,
all or
you know,
nothing. Yeah. Like we don't even realize how small the tiny steps are going because it
yes,
feels like it's your whole world. Like everyone has
exactly.
decisions. I think in the moment it feels like a giant leap
Right.
for mankind. But
Yes.
really it was like, no, just a little aspect here and
Yes.
there.
Just 3 months.
Yeah. Okay, so quickly, because we can go on to the next, I want to hear the next part of your story. But so the person who broke off your engagement, did you guys end up getting married also, or was that another person that you met?
Yeah, actually, that was the person I married.
Okay. And you're still
So,
married
so
today.
I'm still married
Okay.
today,
And
and
had
I
your
think,
babies.
and I'm so grateful that that happened
Mm,
because it helped me build my foundation,
yeah.
not on him, but on like I. That was a phase where I was like devastated. I'm like,
Mm,
how could this happen? I did all the right things. I was pure. I married. I was dating someone who's like, it says, do not be yoked with unbelievers. He believed. And then why did this happen?
yeah.
And I think God was helping me develop my trust in Him.
Yeah.
I was putting my trust in me doing all the right things.
Yeah.
And I loved certainty. I'm like,
Mm,
hey, everything, all the boxes are checked. I got the certainty. And God's like, no.
yeah.
And it was really gentle. So at that time, I studied. I had to like really examine and go back to why did I come here?
Yeah.
I didn't come here to find a husband. I didn't come here to find security in the world.
Yeah.
I came here because I wanted to recognize God and follow Him.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? There were parts of my heart I didn't fully trust Him.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting and like studying out all the scriptures on trusting God.
Mm,
Like, am I going to trust God with this particular broken heart?
yeah.
Or am I going to get bitter and leave and kind of say, well, I trusted you and you hurt me, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's like working through that wall of distrust
I love
and
that. Yeah.
trusting. And then 6 months later, I was married. So
Yeah. Well, and the security and the confidence, I think every step of the way, I think
yeah,
definitely looking back, you can clearly see how you did it. So I don't know how much of those stages you were conscious of it, but I think for those of you
yeah,
listening, I think hearing
yes,
the importance and the value, because that's a lot of the coaching that I do here, is helping us to go back and kind of like just own like, boy, these are decisions that I made. Like, I really did have a choice in the matter. Like, I might have started it for this one particular reason and it didn't go the way I thought it was going to do go, right? But now
mhm,
what? How
yeah,
can I like take back like, no, these are the choices. This is the step of faith that I took with the information I had.
right.
But now what am I going to do, right? What's the
Mhm,
next step? And in
yeah,
every way, face that wall,
yeah,
name your
yeah,
upset, and then
right,
make a decision next, right?
exactly,
So
exactly,
I love
yeah.
that. Okay, so I'm so glad we got that timeline worked out. Thanks for sharing that. So what was the next stage after that? Like, so you had all your kids and you've had, how old would you be at this point? Are your kids still little in the next
Yeah.
phase, or is this like their graduation?
Right. It that the next stage was a pretty long stage. So
Okay.
I had my kids, and then I was in the full-time ministry, and so raising a kid, my kids leading churches, and so that stage is what the researchers call the productive stage,
Mm,
where you start now that you've been trained to be a disciple and you kind of like you're walking
yeah.
and now it's time to serve other people, right? So using your gifts to serve people and go to different countries, and it was just um, it was so refreshing to be
Mhm.
able to see God work. I remember going to different um, countries. And in India, when you're pregnant, people go and sign up for good schools
Mm,
because there are limited seats and you have to give bribes to even get that.
wow.
So I remember like having to sometimes even move cities every 6 months, and my kids, or years, so my kids had to go to different schools. And and for me, as you know, I value education. So I was like,
Mm,
God, I really want to make sure that they go to a good school. And I remember people telling me, like, you can't, you didn't sign up when you were
mm,
pregnant. And I'm like, I remember the world kind of telling you what's important.
mm,
And even just going to God with, God, you've got to figure this out for me. And
yeah.
it was funny. Every city we went, I remember going to a city called Cochin, and we went to the school, and the principal was looking at me like, your kid's in second grade, and I don't think there's going to be a seat for him.
Mm.
And the principal's like, but today, a parent pulled out a kid, and there's a seat in that class. And so it's like at every stage, God always like planned and showed up. And so
Yeah,
I grew in just depending on God to take care of all those things, because
yeah.
I deeply believe, like, when you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, all these things will be given to you as well. And I got to experience
Mm,
that productive stage.
yeah,
And then 2003 happened, and as my kids were growing up, I felt like it's time for me to just come back to the States and be with my family, kind of give stability for my children to go to schools and stay in one school in one city. My husband decided to accept a position to lead the church here in Grand Rapids.
mm,
But they didn't have finances for me, so I had to get a full-time job.
okay.
And so I remember that stage, and that moves us to the wall of the productive stage, when you get like this overachievement and burnout, you know,
Mm,
trying to kind of lost balance,
yeah,
trying to do.
yeah,
And that was the wall in that productive stage where God was like, hey, it's time to take a break.
yeah.
And I remember when I had to step down from that position, which leads me to the next stage. But I don't know if you have any questions about that productive stage.
Yeah, well, so just to even highlight then your era. So you had two teenagers at that time when you came, so you
Yes,
went from India to Grand Rapids is in Michigan, just in case y'all don't know your
yes.
geography. That's a city in
Well, we
Michigan.
went to India to
You went
Chicago,
to Chicago
and then Chicago to
to
Michigan. Yeah.
Michigan with teenagers. So even just a culture shock, your
Yes.
work shock,
Yeah.
a really hard stage because I have a teenager, so I'm very emotionally attached and connected to the
Yes.
teenage stage. Like so much going on, like as
Yeah.
if like your whole world just completely changed,
Exactly.
right?
And all these fears, because in Chicago, my kids were getting connected. It's a bigger church, and they had a teen ministry,
Mm,
and my daughter was um, finishing up eighth grade, and my son was a senior.
wow.
So they were, and so they were both in these stages where, uh, you want them to have community, you want them to have peers,
Yeah.
and so I was like literally plucking them out
Mm,
again and bringing them to a church in Grand Rapids is very small, and there's no teen ministry.
yeah. And probably a
And
whole lot
so,
less diverse, even I would imagine.
yes,
Like
yes, definitely not diverse at all.
very
So
white.
yes, yes, yes. So there were like cultural shocks, I guess, you go through.
Yeah.
And I remember that stage where one of the things with parenting, and I can look back and reflect on it now, because I
Mm,
have my kids are adults now. They both married. My son is
mm.
expecting a baby. And
Yay.
so I asked them, about what was it like? You know, because
Yeah.
you as a mom, you really want like, what's best for your kids? And
Yeah.
did I make mistakes or what happened? And
Yeah.
I did make a lot of mistakes, but I appreciate the faithfulness of God
Mm,
because I remember my daughter, both of my uh, my kids decided to follow God. They became disciples and they
mm,
married disciples there in the church in Los Angeles. But I asked my daughter, what was it like, because there's no teens in this church in that time. She told me, yeah, I felt really bad that I had to move. And I remember coming to this church and like, why am I even in this church?
mm.
Because there's nobody like me. There's no one I can even relate to.
Yeah.
And I think one of the deep convictions I had when raising teenagers was praying to God that He makes Himself real to them
Mm,
and make my Christian life attractive to them. I wanted them
mm,
to see God in everything. I wanted them to like experience His love. And even though we didn't have anything moving in the chaos, God's
mm.
there, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I remember her, like when she decided to follow God, I said, "Why did you decide to follow God?" And she said, Mom, thank you for moving me because I remember when I was studying the Bible in Chicago, I wanted to study because my friends were studying.
Mm,
I wanted to be like everybody else. And
yeah.
if I didn't choose God, then I won't be accepted. And I had all these pressures.
Mm,
But in Grand Rapids, I had to decide like,
yeah.
who is this God? Do I really want this?
Yeah.
And it was me and him because my friends were in the world. I went to a high
Yeah.
school that's a public school, and so I didn't have peers here, but
Yeah.
I had to build my own faith.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated God's faithfulness in that,
Yeah.
um, in just bringing himself, making himself real to them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is that
Mhm.
productive life stage.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah. No, that was perfect. Well, and I wonder, just out of curiosity, this isn't really on
yes.
our topic per se, but I wonder even like what part was harder? Was it the like, because India would be a very different, like, it's not the United States, right? So you're kind of
Yeah.
like a third world to a first
Yeah.
world.
Mhm.
Versus then, like, was it the American culture that was so hard going to Grand Rapids even, or was it
Yeah.
literally like just not seeing anybody that looked like you're like not having any cultural
Yeah.
diversity?
Right.
Or is it hard to distinguish because maybe they were all one and the same? I don't know.
Well, I think part of when I was in India, being in the full time ministry, and this was also the internet was just coming.
Hmm.
So I remember coming here with the internet, like having someone else come into my home,
Mm.
and to influence my children.
Oh yeah.
Before there was like I could protect them.
Yeah.
And so now all these worldly influences are there
Yeah.
because all their friends had phones, all their friends, there's this peer pressure that you feel here to assimilate.
Mm.
And you have to um, be like everybody else.
Yeah.
So that was the pressure. And if you are different, and the way that our brain works is when you see somebody different, sometimes different means not good enough.
Mm.
Different means wrong.
Yeah.
Different means, oh, I don't like the food you eat, or that's different. So that pressure
Yeah.
to assimilate,
Yeah.
and yet be okay with your own identity.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of identity battles,
Yeah. Yeah.
when you are, um, in a culture where you're a minority.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
And I kind of felt that when I was in India too, because growing up in the States, even though I looked Indian, it was like
Yeah.
I felt different. I
Yeah.
felt the other.
Yeah.
So it was a journey of learning
Yeah.
to uh, kind of work through the wall of the us versus them,
Yeah.
feeling like the other
Yeah.
um, mindsets.
Yeah. I love that you brought that part up too, because I think that is also, it just is human nature. And that's kind of what you said in the beginning too, right? Where we other ourselves, we other people, and we will find any reason
Right?
to compare and feel less than or better
Yes.
than, right? Like me versus you mentality. So whether it's American versus Indian culture, rich or poor,
Right?
dark or white, right? Like whatever the skin tone, our body size, our
Yes.
education, right? Like there's any
Yeah.
reason under the sun we can come up with, we will naturally feel othered or
Yes.
other others, right?
Right. And I think that is the fight, which kind of leads to that next stage
Mm,
is the journey inward.
mm,
Where do we really put our worth in?
yeah,
Is it in those things that are our skin color or the where we went to school or
yeah,
all those things? Um, and I think the challenge, what I noticed when come in doing ministry in India and then doing ministry here, there's also the whole individualistic
mm,
versus the collectivist cultural mindsets.
yeah,
And individualistic is and growing up in a multicultural home where my parents were, they were first generation immigrants to the States. And so I had a lot of conflicts with, uh, for example, my dad. He didn't have a choice in who he chose a career. And you notice this with a lot of Indians, they choose careers that pay a lot. So you have a
mm,
lot of the doctors and because you have to support your family.
yeah,
And so all his money he would send to my grandparents, and he
mm,
helped his brothers and sisters, and they're all in the States. And so when I had to choose what I want to study or even decide to go in the ministry,
mm,
he was like, you don't have a choice for yourself, you know?
mm,
And he was very gracious and he allowed me to choose that. But that was also a cultural, like, hey, I want to choose what I want to do for my
mm.
life.
Yeah. You sound very
Yeah.
American, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that whole
Yeah,
different cultural values
yeah.
also had to be worked through.
Yeah. Which I imagine, even as a side note, I think that still is very challenging, even just as a Christian, right? Because Jesus, like, I remember reading a book that really helped me. I was like, Jesus saves the individual, but he calls us to be a part of a group, right? And I think
Yes.
it can be very confusing of
Yes.
when do we personally sacrifice for the
Right.
greater good, and when is it really about me? So
Yes.
again, let's go deeper into your inward. That probably is really where it
Yeah.
is, right? Of just our
Yeah.
inward relationship with
Yes.
our faith. So what was you can let's go into that stage then.
Yeah. I think the journey inward is us, for me, finding who I'm uniquely created by God
Mm,
to give. And even with my children. So I think we all have, we are created in the image of God.
yeah.
So we are individuals, but at the same time, we have to connect with God to find out what was his purpose
Yeah.
for us to live in this world. What can we contribute, whether to the world, to the church?
Yeah.
And what happens is the mindsets that we grew up in, whether it's collectivist culture is where you depend on you do what's best collectively.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when someone I'll give you an example in school. We have because I train educators, and we have a classroom where we have students from different backgrounds. So there was uh, a teacher that was grading papers, and one of the kids failed.
Mm.
And so the kid, who was brought up in an individualistic culture, would look at that paper and says, "Oh man, I failed."
Mm-hmm.
A kid that was actually a Native American kid, and Native Americans have a collectivist mindset. So that kid was very distressed. And the
Mm-hmm.
teacher was like, "Why are you so sad? You passed, you're getting an A." She was like, "If one of us fails, we all fail.
Mm.
What did so you feel the pain of the whole
Yeah.
versus when you're individual, it's like, I'm good, I'm okay."
Yeah.
You see that different mindsets. And um, so those kind of differences
Yeah.
in emotions, like how did our experiences shape us?
Yeah.
So it's that
Yeah.
that journey inward. And so
Yeah.
for me, one of the things that I battled with was just um, the whole shame concept,
Mm.
like feeling bad about myself if I like, so we're going back to after the productive life when God said, "Hey, I think you need to just step down and focus on me."
Yeah.
So God had a plan for me because he had a plan for me to work on my doctorate, to write a
Mm-hmm.
book, but I'm this person who wants to do everything.
Yeah.
So he literally had to come and like pause and say, "Stop, you
Yeah.
are no longer going to be in the ministry.
Yeah.
I want you to work on me." And so that's the journey inward.
Yeah.
But for me, it came with a feeling of failure.
Mm.
Like, even though I wasn't typically paid by the church
Yeah.
and I was still working full time,
Yeah.
but it's that meaning that we take from our experiences.
Yeah.
And so I remember that hitting this wall of really going back into, okay, why am I doing this journey I started with God?
Yeah.
What do you want me to do here? Got this ministry, and the
Yeah.
ministry was a lot more where I got my worth from, like serving God and
Yeah.
uh, bearing good fruit. And
Yeah.
so that wall of that overachievement and putting my security in my performance or my title or a role,
Yeah.
when that was taken away, I felt like kind of like wobbly.
Ah.
And so I hit this wall
Mm.
of, am I going to give up performing and really get my joy from God? So that was another journey. There's this loss of certainty,
Yeah.
the loss of coming in, and am I okay just being an ordinary disciple now
Yeah.
after 40 years in the ministry?
Yeah.
Where do I fit in?
Yeah.
So that transition
Yeah.
that hit a wall.
Yeah. And how to, I'm sure, because you kind of talked about it too in the beginning of these feelings where we're like judging ourselves versus other people, or even proving our value, proving it to
Yes.
ourselves, or it's proving it to other
Yeah.
people, or other people approve, but we really just want
Yeah.
God's approval, right? It gets so blurry.
Yes.
But then to face it and to feel like I think the immediate reaction is it always doesn't ever feel good. There's the shame, there's
Right.
the we're clearly being corrected somehow,
Yeah.
like, or these other people have failed me. Like, it's not fair, right? Like, it shouldn't be this way. To
Yes.
somehow transitioning, like, how could this possibly be a blessing and not a withheld blessing,
Yeah.
or not like a punishment or a correction, but it could even still be like, gosh, like a healthy, helpful
Yeah.
discipline, like of, because if we don't go through those hard things, we would
Yeah.
never choose, right? Like, I love hearing people's stories too in those, like, oh my gosh, if this horrible
Yeah.
thing hadn't happened to me, like, I would have never chosen this, but it was done to
Right.
me.
Yeah.
But it brought me to this other space,
Yes.
right? And so maybe that might even be a good segue into telling us like about your book and how did that come
Yeah.
about, and maybe like how long
Yes.
did that take in that journey between like that last stage that you're talking about to that
Yes.
part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It actually led me to write a book because I would be so distressed
Mhm.
because I reached out to mentors, I reached out to people in the church, and I couldn't find anybody to help me.
Yeah.
And one of my your mom
Mhm.
was like she's my best friend. So
Oh,
she was there through this whole process, trying to help me make sense of this.
yeah.
And I remember like not able to sleep, and I
Mm.
would pray to God. I'm like, what am I going to? And I was also going through menopause, so so it's
No big deal,
like,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Just that
So I was
small
like,
thing. Yeah.
like, what should I do in the night? And I remember reading about Samuel and him saying, um, "Okay, Lord, speak. Your servant is listening."
Mm,
So I would get myself out of my bed and go sit on the table, and I would say, "Speak, Lord,
mm.
your servant is listening." And whatever he said, I just started writing.
Yeah.
And that's how the book came about.
Wow.
And so it was all, I totally say this is God's book. It's not me. I'm like, where did all these
Mm.
ideas come from? It's just sitting with the Lord and
Yeah.
learning to listen
Mm.
and really learning how to have a joy infused life
Yeah.
through the processes that God has planned. And so I remember when asking, what should I call it? And he said, Sparkle. And I was like, Sparkle,
Yeah.
what's that? And then diving into that, looking for what does that mean, sparkle?
Yeah.
And there's this researcher called Alan Shore who researches babies to find out when do the parts of our brain, that joy part of our brain, light up.
Mm.
And what he found was when kids find or believe that they're the sparkle in their parent's eye,
Mm.
that's when the joy part of their brain lights up.
Yeah. Wow.
And he also found that kids that didn't have that, it was harder for them to grasp joy.
Mm.
And so God was trying to tell me, when you know that you're the sparkle in my eye,
Yeah.
your security, your strength comes from me,
Yeah.
not from your performance, not from what people think.
Mm.
For a long time, I found he also revealed the idol that I was literally worshiping was what leaders thought about me is who I thought I am.
Mhm.
What, people in
Yeah.
authority, whether my parents and so I had to really figure out that do the work, and
Yeah.
one of the steps in the book actually is an acronym. So S is secure love, really
Mhm.
getting your security from God and him loving you
Yeah.
so much that you have so much love to give others. It doesn't have
Mhm.
to come from a role, it doesn't have to come from someone having to tell you do this.
Yeah.
It's you're so filled with love that you can pour it to your kids,
Yeah.
pour it to your husband. You're secure in his love.
Yeah.
And that's the first step. The P is perseverance. Perseverance
Mm.
must finish its work so that you can be mature and complete. And so when we hit the wall, each of these stages have walls.
Yeah.
God's plan is we have to persevere through it. We have to go
Mm.
through the wall, beyond the wall.
Yes.
And perseverance, what I found when I was studying perseverance was there's this resistance to
Mm.
perseverance. And the book talks a lot about it. It's called acedia. It's something that the desert fathers found, the
Mm.
spiritual sloth, where we don't have the strength.
Yeah.
And so how do we push through that and get that? That's
Mm.
what he is all about. And then A is appreciation anchors, where
Mm.
our body keeps a score. So, and our brains are trained to look at negative things.
Mm.
So, building an appreciation anchor helps you um, recreate your joy centers.
Mm.
And then R is rebuilding trust. And then K is what I was going to share. K is kindsight. And it's actually a word that I created because I had to go back to my past
Mm.
and look at it with kindness. and
Mm.
God's presence. So I was like, why am I so stressed about
Yeah.
this? What do I take this? Where do I get this depressed feeling? Why am I struggling so much?
Yeah.
And I remember reaching out to a coach. Having a coach is huge. So thank you so much for
Mm.
being willing to be a life coach,
Yeah.
because it really helps. And your mom was
Mm.
is an amazing safe space. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you got that from her.
Mhm.
But just like working through that. And
Yeah.
one of the things my coach asked me was, when was the first time you felt this way?
Mm.
And I remember, like, it was hard to kind of remember, but this image came into my mind where when I was 5, my dad sent me to piano classes.
Mhm.
And I remember going uh, up the stairs, sitting down and waiting for the piano teacher to call me. And she would never call me. And then I would hear my dad's honk, and then I would run out. And my dad came up one day. This happened several times then, and
Yeah.
he came to pay the fees. And then the piano teacher was a nun, and she looked at my dad and she looked at me, and she told my dad she never showed up to class. And I was so confused. My dad's confused. And then she looked at me and she said, why didn't you speak up? But
Mm.
as a 5-year-old, when you see an adult disapproving of you,
Yeah.
and you're confused why, what you did wrong.
Yeah.
I remember the feeling. That was my first experience of feeling shame.
Mm.
And shame is should have already mastered everything.
Mm.
So I felt the shame in my body, like I felt small, I felt
Yeah.
invisible. And my coach was like, um, where was Jesus in this scenario?
Yeah.
And my brain could not find Jesus. And then finally, I'm like, I think he was probably standing next to the nun, shaking his head like,
Mm.
you should have stood up and came in. And my coach was like,
Wow.
that is not Jesus. And so then I realized why I have this
Yeah.
tendency to want to uh, prove myself or not go to God
Yeah.
for help,
Yeah.
because I should already know.
Yeah.
I should have mastered it.
Yeah.
So when I'm corrected,
Mm.
or when I go through failure, it's like, what's wrong with me? I should already know. It's not a position of help me. I never asked for help. And again, that
Yeah.
individualistic mindset, well, I should already know.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I think that was a breakthrough for me, because she said, is that the Jesus in the Bible?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she said how Jesus would probably come down and look at you in the
Yeah.
eye as a 5-year-old and say, thank you so much for being respectful, because you were taught not to speak up,
Mm.
to wait for the adult to call on you, and you were doing what's right. And the nun's response was just a lack of training on her part as a teacher. Now that I know that, since I train teachers,
Yeah.
because we clearly tell people their expectations and not assume they should already know,
For
right?
sure.
And so that really reframed.
Mm.
So just looking at my past through hindsight, like
Yeah.
those negative emotions that we carry,
Yeah.
like, where did it begin? What were the distortions?
Yeah.
How did Satan plant these lies that you believe?
Yes.
So that's that process of hindsight.
Yeah. I love that you brought that story up because I think it is so crucial to healing the past, right? So that we can create a new future. Like we get to re-choose or recreate our
Yes.
image of who God was, right? Because we don't realize in those moments that like
Yeah.
we said God said, right? Like
Right.
and we don't
Yes.
even know. And it's such a
Yeah.
gift to each of us to be
Yeah.
willing. Like it's scary to go back to those. It feels uncomfortable. But I think that's also the grace of God that He brings us to these points where we're now at the capacity,
Yes.
to go to those deeper places, right? Like
Yes.
we've done a lot on our own strength or
Right.
already like just what our natural abilities, and then we're like, okay, we
Yeah.
can't. God's like, I want more for you.
Yeah.
This can be even
Yeah.
better, but it's going to be uncomfortable. Are we willing to go deeper into that journey? So
Exactly.
valuable. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So, what
Yeah.
was, I think we have L and E left. What were those?
Yes. L is leverage listening. So it's all about learning to listen to God. And then E is embrace maturity. So it's
Mm,
as a book, it talks about all the different stages and how do we embrace it and grow in maturity.
yeah.
And we're not stuck in these walls in these different stages. So
Yeah.
that's what the book is about.
Wow. Where can people buy it? Is it on Amazon? Like, is it?
Yes, it is on Amazon.
Oh,
Yes.
fantastic. I love that. So is it workbook form where people like are journaling, or is it more just a reading?
It's both. It's reading, and then I'm actually doing a book study with women because these are deep processes
Mhm.
that we do in community,
Yeah.
and it's like when you want to be formed and like formed in God's image,
Yeah.
because we're not. It helps to have like it helped me to have mentors and coaches.
Yeah.
So this is a book that groups can do,
Yeah.
and there are companion guides for that too.
Yeah.
So
I love that. Yeah. It's so valuable to have community for those reasons, right? And especially when we're all like choosing to be in that boat of like
yeah,
reassessing ourselves and personal reflection and wanting healing, and we're like active listening. I forgot what was
yes,
the L, learning to listen or
Le- leverage listening.
leverage listening.
Yes,
Totally. Like, how do we just stop talking so much? We already know, like, we already think we know what the answer is and what it should be and what it shouldn't, right?
yes,
I love that of being able to leverage
yes.
listening.
Because a lot of times, even in our prayers, we're the ones talking.
Yeah.
How do we just sit still and listen?
Yeah. It's so hard. I just like to say on here a lot of just being curious, right? Like if we can stop already knowing or even
Yes,
judging what's happening, like how
yes,
about we can just be curious, even
yep,
curious of what other people might be doing or thinking or why they're
right,
doing what they're doing, and
yes,
not already needing to know or
exactly.
the shame, like we should have already known this. We should have already mastered it. I love that. Well,
Yes,
Pam, thank you so much for sharing that journey with us. I think that's such a valuable, um, just a concept to keep in mind as we're going to
mhm,
like, there's just natural rhythms of life, right? Like, it makes me think of even just child rearing. You have like your
yep,
infant stage, and then they
exactly.
go to preschool, and then you get to high
Yep,
school. Like, by then, you should be able to teach other people and you've mastered a lot. But then we get to mature again if we're willing,
yes,
right? To
yeah,
always be leveling up and the value in
yeah,
that. And like I said in the beginning, to not automatically take that correction, the upset, the unfamiliar as like a correction. You
yep,
shouldn't be here. If you were
yeah,
better, if you were smarter, you wouldn't be going through this. And instead, when we can at
yeah,
least quiet that part, right? And just let it, like, just be in the moment, listen, get curious to
yes,
see where we're trying to get better and have more healing, more grace, more love, more
yes,
capacity, as
yes,
opposed to losing it. So,
yeah,
so valuable
yeah,
today. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Any last nuggets you want to share? You shared so many great
yeah.
things, or even tell us where people can find you. And I'll put a link to your book in the show notes as well. So, any
Yeah.
last thoughts?
Well, I think I would love for our audience to remember that they're the sparkle in God's eye.
Mm,
And so when we fall, think about what you and I are parents. And remember when our children are learning to walk and they kept falling, they just got up.
yeah.
And we're delighting in them just taking that small step. And that's how God is with us is we
Mm,
take these baby steps. As I look back at my life and those
yeah.
baby steps, even in my shame, even like just taking those steps forward,
Yeah.
and he's like delighting in us and he's happy for us. So
Yeah.
just remember that you are the sparkle in God's eye.
I love that. What a great reminder. Thanks so much, Pam.
Yes.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Walls. If this episode inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend and leave a review. Your support helps more women step into their courage and purpose. Ready for more? Subscribe to the podcast and contact me. You can find me at beyondthewallspodcast.com. Reach out for coaching, more resources, and all the support you could need. Remember, breaking through the walls is just the beginning. Your best life is waiting.